Welcome to We Love History Live. I'm Bryony from the digital team here at Historic Environments Scotland. And while we're in lockdown, we're giving you a bit of an insight into our work on Scotland's history through these live stream events. This is a Q&A session, so if you'd like to ask a question, you'll need to log into YouTube, which you can do with your own Google account or YouTube account. So today we're going to be looking at local identity and remembrance, and I've got Dr. Laura Harrison with me here. She works in our cultural resources team, so hello, Laura.
Hello, nice to be here.
And I guess we'll just kick straight off. Again, if you've got any questions for Laura as we go through, just drop them in the live chat and we'll pick them up as we go. So, Laura, when we're talking about commemoration, what do we kind of mean by that? And when did it start happening? When did commemoration become a thing?
Yeah, so there's sort of two answers to that question. So on one hand, remembering the past is definitely not a new phenomenon. We see that there's oral histories in a lot of different cultures. They were building memorials to the past in ancient Rome, whether it was sort of triumphal arches or funerary stones. In Scotland, it's possible that some of the Pictish stones were commemorative in some way in nature. However, there's definitely sort of what you would call a modern kind of turn to commemoration in the 19th century, both in Europe and in North America. And really, that has to do with the growth of history as an academic subject. So since we started actually studying the past, it kind of made sense that you would also be remembering that past. Also, around that time, of course, there were a series of sort of large scale conflicts, sort of culminating in the world wars. And this is when war memorials really became significant, which I think is really one of the key ways we kind of think about commemoration now. And in the UK, that actually started not with the First World War, like a lot of people think, but it was sort of popularized during the South African War, which is one of the first wars when bodies of the dead were not repatriated, so they weren't brought back to the UK. So war memorials were sort of a space for grieving. And then obviously that became really significant during the First and Second World War. So it's sort of interesting that we've had this history of kind of like celebrating through commemoration, and then more recently also this sort of like grieving through commemoration. And I think you see both of those things kind of throughout what we're going to be talking about today.
I think that's a really, really interesting point that you were saying there about kind of commemoration developing at the same time as the studies. So I suppose there was more archaeology and there was more understanding of the past, kind of we were wanting to mark it in some ways. So what kind of things, you've mentioned there World War, you've mentioned there about kind of the role of grieving and wanting to remember people, wanting to remember events. So when we're talking about commemoration, are we talking about events or are we talking about people?
Yeah, so it's definitely a bit of both. So one of my favorite bits of commemoration is a memorial in Ceres in Fife that's to the Battle of Bannockburn. So I'm sure most people know the Battle of Bannockburn happened in 1314. This memorial was unveiled in 1914, so 600 years after the battle. And on the monument itself, on the plaque, it says that it celebrates both the victory of the Scots at the battle, but also about the local men from the Ceres area that fought in that battle. So it's both about the battle and about the people. And I really love this one because sort of local tradition says that Robert the Bruce, the victor of the battle, granted a fair and market to be held in the town on the anniversary following Bannockburn as sort of a thank you to the local men who were involved. And I'm not sure if this has continued since then, but indeed this series, Highland Games, takes place every year and are sort of commemorating that act from Bruce, apparently. Yeah, so I think that's a really good example of how it can sort of be both. Other times, commemorations can mark places where things occur. So we often see that with battle sites. There'll be some sort of marker to show that this big battle occurred there. Also, important events. Lots of our sites talk about things where a monarch was born or where they died or where a document was signed or any of those sorts of sort of big events. I think the other thing that's good to keep in mind with commemoration is that we tend to think of it as like statues and monuments and things, but actually commemoration is a lot of different things. So sort of more public things like public art like murals is one of my favorite types of commemoration. We see like memorial services and annual remembrances. Along with those often are sort of marches or parades that happen. You can have commemorative music and songs and books, and certainly we see a lot of that in Scotland. A sort of more personal example is to have endowments, so people can leave money to help support different commemorations that mean something to them individually. And increasingly, we're seeing web-based commemorations as well. So not even necessarily something in like the physical world, but a sort of online commemoration as well.
I think there's some really interesting examples there. Things I probably wouldn't have considered as being, commemoration. I think it's very easy to imagine something physical, something place-based. And I think what you're saying there about parades and these kind of local, more traditions marking an event or something that people do year on year to commemorate or to mark something. I think that's really, really interesting. Just slightly different to what you would normally think when you're trying to sort of put your finger on remembering things and remembrance. So obviously you've got a huge amount of research and knowledge on all of this, Laura. How was it that you kind of became interested in the combination of local identity and commemoration?
Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of fell into it, like all of the best sort of types of research. So I have a PhD in Scottish history that I finished about 2 years ago, and that looked at public commemorations of the Scottish Wars of Independence, but in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I was sort of looking at how people relatively recently thought about and remembered and looked at things that happened hundreds of years ago. And I was kind of particularly interested in why that was so interesting. So, for example, I found that there's at least 35 monuments to the Scottish Wars of Independence that were put up in the last 200 years or so. And I think that's really interesting that, there's monuments to these wars from hundreds of years ago being put up at the same time as First World War memorials. And what sort of different functions do those things have? So that was kind of my like initial interest in that. And for those who aren't that familiar with the 19th century, it was a time when the idea of Scottishness as something that's different than Englishness was sort of really growing. And so that made people really interested in Scottish history at that time, which was definitely helped by the influence of Walter Scott. We can never escape talking about Walter Scott. And so with all of that in mind, I thought that my thesis was going to be about nationalism in Scotland and just the sort of growth of this idea of modern Scotland. But it actually wasn't really about that because I realized that most of the commemorations that I was looking at, some of which I'm going to talk about today, were equally, if not more, sort of about showing a local identity. And so I was really interested in that because in Scotland, we do tend to kind of think of things from a like national perspective. So I wanted to sort of dive into the how are people showing their own local identities. So another one of my favorite examples that came out of my thesis is about Margaret, Maid of Norway. So she was the queen designate of Scotland. It's, questionable if we can call her queen because she wasn't actually crowned, which we'll get to. And so she became that when she was a really young child, when her grandfather, King Alexander III, died. And so she was in Norway at the time, because, hence Maid of Norway, because her mother had married the King of Norway. So she traveled to Scotland to take up her queenship at only 6 years old. But en route, she either through a combination of food poisoning or some other illness or possibly just seasickness, died. And this has actually happened when she was in Orkney. And I say that this is the most relatable death in Scottish history because I also get really bad seasickness. So feel her on this one. So, and it's important to point out that at this time, Orkney and Shetland were still part of Norway, technically, the Norwegian kingdom, not Scotland yet. And this window that you can see is in Shetland, in the Lerwick Town Hall. And it was put there as part of, Shetland celebrating the Norse influence in their history. And that's, I think, really reinforced by the fact that it's actually like a 3-part window. And on the sides, she's flanked on one side by Saint Olaf, who was the king of Norway in the 11th century, And on the other side, Ronvald Brueson, who was joint Earl of Orkney in 1035. So again, it's interesting that it was chosen to celebrate this figure of Scottish history. You know, she would have been a Scottish queen. She certainly had that Scottish ancestry, but she was also very much a Norwegian girl. And so it's almost like celebrating that kind of mix in Shetland of being both Scottish and Norse or Norwegian as well.
I think the Scandinavian links between the islands and Scotland's sort of history, you know, is so strong. So I'm kind of curious, when was this window made?
Oh, that's a really good question. So it was made in the early 20th century, I believe. But I can look up the date for you, definitely. But yeah, it was about the early 20th century.
So it would have been a sort of as much of a reflection of Shetland looking back at its links at the time as really a sort of acknowledgement of her herself. And it's quite unusual, I think, to have women who aren't a saint included in windows and stained glass anyway. Is that right? So this is quite an unusual.
Yeah, that one of the reasons that I found this example so interesting is, as you can imagine from my research, it was all Wallace and Bruce all the time. So the fact that this was exactly of a woman, and also this is one of the only examples that this window was paid for by a woman. We don't really know anything else about her that I have found. But that in itself is interesting. I wonder if there was something there that she sort of identified with differently.
Maybe seasickness.
Yeah.
That would be quite a good offer out to any of our viewers. If you know anything, or if you can help us find anything out about the donor who helped to pay for this window at Lerk Town Hall, let us know, because we can always add this into our records at Historic Environment Scotland. We're always trying to find out more about the people linked to the places. So if you know anything, please add it into the live chat or add a comment onto this video. We'd love to hear from you. Also, if you have any questions for Laura, please do send them in and we'll pick them up as we go along. So Laura, you said that based on your research, kind of how can commoners understand these local identities? So obviously we've got Shetland, and we've got these windows looking into the sort of Scandinavian connections. That's probably a really good example. What about more recent history?
Yeah, so what we sort of choose to remember says a lot about what we value. So this is sort of a good example that we have a lot of statues, like I was saying, to Wallace and Bruce, and clearly there's something about a sort of like medieval hero figure, this like chivalric kind of fighting man that we value or have valued, and so that's sort of what commemorations get put up for, and so that sort of thing can really tell us a lot. Similarly, using the figure of Margaret in Shetland really tells us something about, you know, people seeing themselves with this sort of dual identity between Scandinavian and Scottish as well. And that being said, though, even within the sort of umbrella of local identities, there is a lot of different reasons to commemorate the past locally. So we already talked about First World War memorials a little bit, but it is worth sort of thinking about the sheer number of local war memorials that we see in the UK. I like to cycle, and I always think about this because you basically can't pass a small village in the UK without seeing a war memorial, and I just think that's amazing. When you think about what actually went into that, lots of them are built with public subscription. So actually local people are donating to have this memory place. And it's to the point that there was questions in the 1920s about whether it was even necessary to continue with building the National War Memorial that's at Edinburgh Castle. So obviously it was built. It was decided that this was necessary, but it is interesting that there was so much sort of local outpouring that people were saying, like, should we even bother with this big memorial? Is it even needed? One of those sort of small memorials that I think is quite interesting is the Kitchener Memorial, which is in Orkney, and it was built in 1926. And it was built to honor the memory. So first it was built really to honor the memory of Lord Kitchener, who was the captain of the ship, the HMS Hampshire, which just off the coast in Orkney hit a mine in 1916 and sank. And it was paid for by public subscriptions. So like I said, lots of memorials were, but more recently they've added to the memorial, and they've added that it also now commemorates the 736 other people who died, who were also on the ship, which I think is really shows how our sort of ideas have changed about commemoration, that really at first it was about sort of this big figure that people knew. And obviously I think probably locally it was also about the loved ones people lost, but now we're also equally as interested in sort of commemorating the sort of everyday folk, which I think is really interesting. Other times with local things that we can also be celebrating local connections to history. So a really good example of that is the commemorative plaque scheme here at Hess. So a recent example from that is the plaque that was placed for Frederick Douglass, which is on Gilmore Street in Edinburgh, which is actually just around the corner from my house. And I had never noticed it before, so it was really useful to remember that it was there. So it was placed there in 2018, and it marks the location where Frederick Douglass lived for a time in Edinburgh, and that was part of his work as an abolitionist and an author. And he was organizing many anti-slavery campaigns in Scotland. I'm sure lots of people are really familiar with his work. And then, so just a note about the Hess commemorative plaque scheme, because it's something we get asked about a lot. It recognizes people who gained local, national, and international recognition for their impact and accomplishments that are connected to Scotland. And we put lovely plaques on buildings where they lived or worked or had some connection to them. And you cannot, like, anyone can nominate someone. The best way to do this is to keep an eye out for the next call for nominations. Which I've been told, given the current situation in the world, is probably going to be January 2021. But it's really worthwhile to keep in mind, because it's certainly, I think, a really interesting way of, like I was kind of indicating before, kind of diversifying our commemoration. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. And then the last, well, another way, but the last for this section, that I think about how kind of we can see local identities and commemoration is through promoting sort of local histories. Oftentimes these are kind of like quirky local histories. So this can be either sort of immediately following events, or oftentimes are much later, like the series Bannockburn Memorial that I was talking about earlier, that are kind of connected to these games before. Again, these are really often like through public subscription, because it's something that sort of, you know, caught the imagination of local people. And an example that I know that we both really like, Bryony, is the example of BAMS. That's, there we go. Which is a war memorial on the wharf in Montrose. And it was unveiled in 2006, again, publicly paid for. And it's of a St. Bernard who lived during the Second World War. And he belonged to Captain Hafto of the Norwegian Navy, who was in charge of a minesweeping ship that was stationed in Montrose and Dundee. And the sweet little dog was actually enrolled as an official crew member at one time on the ship. And he's buried on the banks of the South Esk River. So to sort of have, you know, tie back to this really interesting kind of local tradition, and also have, you know, quite a substantial war memorial on the wharf. They built this lovely thing in 2006. So I just think that's a really kind of like a fun example of celebrating a local identity as well.
I think there's probably something in there about how local communities and communities generally kind of identify with these monuments or with whatever commemoration. I know in Edinburgh we've got the Bear statue of Wojtek, who was another animal enrolled in the war, because I think that was clearly a very popular thing to do. Yeah. But it's also a really big symbol for the Polish community in Edinburgh and in Scotland more generally. So I think that there's, you know, it's quite easy to think of war memorials as being quite stoic places, lists of names and individuals, or celebrating specific individuals, as you gave the example with the Kitchener Memorial. But I think that, especially more recent history, do you think there's maybe a change in tone of the kind of commemorations that we're seeing? Do you think that they've become quirkier, more cheerful, animals?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do think so. I think that we certainly see some more examples like this lovely one, and I think that maybe people just see memorials as having sort of a variety of purposes, and indeed they don't just have to be sort of somber places. There's a really famous example in Canada of around the National War Memorial in Canada. Is there has been in the past some issues with kids like skateboarding around there, and there's been debates about, obviously lots of people say that that's disrespectful to the memorial. There's people that go back that say, playing is the exact opposite of war, so maybe that's a good way to sort of celebrate this idea that these kids aren't going off to war. They're skateboarding around and sort of having fun instead. So I think that is also sort of another example of just interesting conversations that we're having around what memorials actually mean and how we sort of best commemorate them.
Absolutely. So we've had a question that's come in. I apologise in advance for my Gaelic. I have been practicing, but it's not quite up to scratch yet. So Ben Nachalik is a mountain on Skye, and the name translates to Hill of the Old Woman. The name in a cairn at the top of the hill commemorates Saucy Mary, a Norwegian princess who was buried at the top, so she could face the country of her birth. Have you come across her in your research?
I have not come across her in my research, but that sounds amazing. Yeah, no, I'm going to look that up, though. I'm going to write this down to look that up. That's such a fun example. I really like that, too, that it's almost like it sounds like a sort of real person that also has kind of come into the kind of the space of myth as well, which is really my favorite sort of historical figure.
Do you find that there's a lot of names that are involved in memorials? Is that another kind of way of marking events or marking individuals?
Yeah, definitely. So there is quite a lot of that was something that I really wanted to look at in my PhD, but I sort of kept hitting a dead end. But yes, you do see a ton of the same sort of names coming up again and again. Oftentimes they're important sort of military figures. Oftentimes that, sometimes politicians and things. And yeah, naming is definitely a really popular bit of commemoration. And I know in commemoration studies, it's sort of a growing field, and it's definitely something I'm really, interested in. It's just if the records are there or not.
Well, thank you very much for the question, Rory. Please do send on in your questions. We've not got that much long left on the live stream, so if there's anything that you want to ask Laura, please do send them in and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So Laura, you kind of talked a little bit about individuals showing their own identity through commemoration. Obviously, we just touched on the kind of communities. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is something that, again, I wasn't really expecting to run into. There's lots of it sort of municipalities and local communities showing their own identities, but there is also a lot of sort of personal and familial connections, which I would classify as a local identity. So an example of a sort of familial connection is at Dunfermline with Bruce's tomb at Dunfermline. So when his tomb, we think, was discovered at Dunfermline in 1818. The Earls of Elgin, which are descendants of Bruce, were involved in sort of the reinterment of that. And it's interesting that at the time, bones were discovered that were believed to be those of Bruce's wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, and they were actually reburied not beside Bruce, but in the Elgin family vault, which I think is definitely an interesting example of that kind of familial connection and how that being sort of the most important bit of where these bones should end up. And yeah, we've got a nice picture of Bruce's tomb there. And then a personal connection that I just love is my very favorite statue of Wallace, which was built in 1814. So it's one of the earliest commemorations to the Wars of Independence, and it's near Dryborough, in the in the Scottish borders. And it was built by David Stewart Erskine, who is the 11th Earl of Buchan. And he was quite a character. So Buchan founded the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, although he was asked to leave just 10 years after it was founded. And one of his less popular plans was the Caledonian Temple of Fame, which he thought would act as a sort of shrine to famous Scots to be located at Dryburgh Abbey. And while this was ultimately unsuccessful, the paintings that he collected did become the foundation collection for the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. So he did have quite a bit of influence. He corresponded for a time with George Washington, and he actually sent him a snuff box that was apparently made from wood from the tree where Wallace hid following the Battle of Falkirk, which Washington actually returned. And we're coming to the statue. He made a number of improvements to his land around Dryburgh, including a statue of Wallace, which is 6.6 meters tall. If anyone gets a chance to go, I would highly recommend it because you cannot appreciate how big the statue is until you're in front of it. And the statue has caused some controversy. Walter Scott was said to have hated it. Someone wrote a really amazing letter to the editor of the newspaper saying that the statue had startled his horse so much that the horse bolted, to which someone replied that you shouldn't blame a statue for a skittish horse and a poor rider.
Well.
But yes, indeed. But the best bit of all of this is that there's absolutely no clear reason about why Buchan built an absolutely enormous statue of Wallace beyond just that he really liked Wallace and he thought he was like a worthy figure of history, and he decided to build a statue of him on his property, which I just really like. And it sort of sums up everything I think about these kind of like really personal stories of commemoration as well.
I think that's absolutely fascinating that there was an idea about this kind of Hollywood Stars of Scotland style shrine that was intended at the start of the century, and it kind of has morphed into what we know today as the National Portrait Gallery. I think that's really, really interesting, National Scottish Portrait Gallery. That's really interesting. We've had a couple of questions while you were talking there.
Okay.
So one of them from Heritage Harvest. I was curious, and this is kind of coming back to you, obviously you love your topic about folklore and myths. So are there many memorials based on folklore and stories such as Greyfriars Bobby and not on actual events or verified events?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mix. So there are there's obviously a statue to Greyfriars Bobby that is very much sort of has perpetuated that myth. I think I'm not sure that we would remember Bobby nearly as much if not for his lovely little statue. And you don't see too many sort of I guess actually I think it's changing a little bit. So you do see sort of some more mythical figures coming up in more sort of modern art. Like I'm thinking of like the Kelpies and that sort of thing. We kind of see that more recently with people becoming really interested in sort of showing different myths and stuff. What you definitely see in sort of the period I was studying, like the 19th century and early 20th century, I think you see a lot of what I called landscape monuments, by which I referred to like places in the landscape that are associated with these figures that people kind of see as like natural monuments. And so you get a lot of like stones where Bruce sat to watch a battle, or like trees that Wallace hid in, or caves where someone stopped on their like journey that obviously we have no idea, but this local tradition is really built up around them. And I think it is interesting that they're just like parts of the natural environment that have kind of become monuments in their own right.
At the start of your answer there, you sort of compared the artworks of the Kelpies. What is it about the artworks that would be different to being considered as a commemorative or a memorial?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think it's like a hard and fast line. I think in a way, to take the Kelpies, for example, they definitely are, I think, would be classified as like public art. But I think that lots of statues and things are also classified as public art, or they're definitely made to be consumed by the public and made to be beautiful and things. And so I think it's quite a yeah, it's hard to make like a hard and fast distinction, which is definitely something I ran into when I was trying to, you know, say, okay, what is a commemoration to me? And it turns out that it can be a lot of things, as we were kind of discussing.
Absolutely. We've had another question that's come in. This one's from Sammy, saying that he's always been struck by war memorials. And in Germany, they're hidden away kind of at the top of mountains sometimes. Are there big differences between the way that memorials are erected by history's winners compared to the losers? And obviously, I think going back to maybe a comparison between World War One and World War Two memorials in Britain versus in Germany would be quite a good example there.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that there is certainly something different with winners and losers. And we see that even going back to, you know, at the start, I sort of was talking about Rome and things, and they built these massive memorials to the battles that they won, right? And I think also, I think in the example given between, you know, the UK and Germany, I think it's also just how sort of like the complicated feelings around that. I think that it's really it's it was just simpler, I think, to commemorate the war dead in the UK based on sort of the rhetoric around the war at the time, and so thus it makes sense why there's sort of war memorials on every little town and things, whereas obviously it was slightly more complicated in Germany, and thus it's sort of like a more you have to kind of seek out this situation. I do think that something that sort of reminds me of, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon, is after the First World War, we actually see an uptick of people commemorating medieval battles at the same time, which is the time that I would have thought it would be the opposite. But it's because there was sort of this effort to like make sense of the First World War. So to sort of place it on this line of, well, we've always had these big battles, but now will be a period of peace and like we'll have sorted things out. And obviously the Second World War proved that that wasn't true. And actually it's after the Second World War, we see a huge drop off of commemorations to medieval battles, because that kind of like reasoning just didn't make sense to people anymore.
Yeah, I think going back to that, the war dwindle, wars kind of messaging. I wonder if
Exactly.
the meaning to the societies at the time, maybe the memorials weren't the source of comfort that they were when they first went up then.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
that's
that's very
really
true.
interesting. Um, One of the last questions then, before we finish up, Laura. Obviously, we've been talking all about local identity and local commemoration. Why local rather than national identity?
For sure. So in a way, like I said, just so many of the examples that I was looking at for my thesis just ended up being about local identity. But of course, identities are complicated. So you can be commemorating a lot of different things at the same time. So, you know, a local memorial or a memorial could be put up that was sort of like about this local event, but it's still kind of tying into a narrative about Scottish history or even about someone's personal history or about European history, or, you know, obviously there's lots of things like being layered over at the same time. But I'll give you an example of sort of a what was definitely like a national commemoration, just to give a bit of contrast. So national commemorations, you often get some quite good stories about because there's so many people involved in them. It's just a much bigger process. So an example is actually of the Wallace and Bruce statues that are at Edinburgh Castle. Anyone who's been to Edinburgh Castle would have seen them because they are, as you can see here in the picture, they're right as you come up to the front entrance to the castle itself. So these were unveiled in 1929, so they're actually relatively new compared to the castle itself. And they caused a lot of controversy. So they were paid in part by, there was an endowment left by someone when they died in the 1830s. And this person actually envisaged a fountain in Princess Street Gardens that would have Wallace and Bruce sort of like facing each other with like their swords out, and the streams of water would be coming out the ends of their swords. And I'm actually quite sad that this didn't get built because I think that would have been amazing. But instead, in the early 1920s, they said, okay, we have to finally do something with this money, and so they decided that Edinburgh Castle was the right place. And originally, there was talk of the statues going in front of the National War Memorial that was being built at that time in the castle. But there was a lot of debate about whether that was actually appropriate, which is also interesting. So if it was appropriate to have these like ancient war heroes on this new war memorial. So there was a lot of decision about where they should go before finally they decided to place them here in these niches that they built specially for them. But then there was a lot of debate about how much brick should be between the niche and the door to make sure that they were like adequately given the amount of gravitas that they deserved and things. There were so many letters sent about these. And then there was also questions about, so they needed a bit more money than the endowments. There's also questions about who should pay for it. So there's suggestions that Wallace should be paid for by Glasgow City Council, since this was a national commemoration and he was from that area, which didn't end up happening. And then there was a whole lot that I could get into, but that would take another hour, about the apparent historical accuracy of how they looked and of their clothing and stuff. But one of my very favorite quotes that I found in my thesis came from these statues, which was His Majesty's sculptor for Scotland at the time, which was J.P. McGilvray. He said that, I'll just quote him here. I suppose the descendants of the Scots who bled with Wallace and followed the lead of Bruce are all dead. Indeed, they've been dead for 600 years. He says, and that we are now in a kind of topsy-turvy age that does not care what is popularly known as a damn about those things of nationality and ancestors. So basically, he was saying, like, these kids today don't care about history, and so it's good we have these. And I just think it's such a great line because somebody could be saying it today. And so, yeah.
That's quite cyclical.
Yes, exactly.
Timeless.
Yeah.
It's interesting that they were such a cause of controversy. Do you think that one of the reasons for that was because they were trying to be presented as a national, I think Edinburgh Castle in itself can often be seen as a sort of national symbol, rather than a local identity. Obviously, people who live in Edinburgh will see it and be very familiar with it as part of the cityscape and the skyline. But it is obviously similar to the Forth Bridge. It's one of our international landmarks. Do you think that having these new statues added into that building was more challenging because they were presented in a national way?
Definitely, yeah, because these were supposed to be like the memorials of Wallace and Bruce, these big figures in history. And so, yeah, there was lots of calls saying that they weren't big enough, that they should have been placed on the esplanade, in these huge things as well. And there was also actually a lot of concern for the castle itself. So there was a lot of people that were worried that they would sort of ruin the medieval look of the castle, to which people sort of fairly said, we just placed a huge national war memorial in the middle of the castle. So I'm not sure that like two statues, are as any more of a sort of alien concept than that. But it's interesting that it went both ways, that people were both worried about the statues and also worried about their placement in the castle as well.
That is really interesting. Thank you, Laura. I think one last question then to finish us off. I don't think we've got any more questions coming in from the audience. Let me just double check. No, I think that it's just me now. So just to finish us off then, Laura, obviously we've talked quite a lot about statues and we've talked quite a bit about war memorials. What are the other kinds of examples of commemoration?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that there are, sorry, I think I lost you for a second. Okay, we're back. There's so many different examples of commemoration. So I think that it's just about I think it's more about like a personal definition for people. Like I think if people are, thinking of Day of the Dead ceremonies and things, then that is obviously like a really familial sort of type of commemoration. Or obviously we have these different statues and things, or even another example of sort of a municipal identity that I really love is a place called Wallacestown in Ontario in Canada. And they have really, cashed in on that name of Wallace. And they've got a huge mural of William Wallace up in their town, and lots of the street names are named after him and things. So I think it's so hard to put it in sort of like a box just because there's so many different types of commemoration. If we just consider commemoration to be how we remember the past, then it's a lot of things.
I think that's an excellent note to end it on. one thing to keep an eye out for our audience, we're going to be providing some new guidance going to consultation soon to kind of help communities and local authorities look at local heritage and how to help get that recognised, kind of engage with these conversations. So keep an eye out for that in the next couple of months. We're going to be going to consultation. It'll be a public consultation, so anyone can take part and have their say. So thank you very much for spending the afternoon with me, Laura. This has been really, really interesting. And thank you to everybody who's sent in questions. I'd also like to say thank you to Santi, who's been behind the scenes and helping all of this happen with our technical support. So thank you very much, and goodbye from us.